You know that feeling when something's watching you? I thought I knew what that meant until last summer. What happened during those 3 days in the Cascade Mountains still keeps me up at night, and I'm about to tell you exactly why you should never ignore that primal instinct that screams at you to run. My buddy Jake and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We're both pretty experienced outdoorsmen, done plenty of backpacking through Washington State. So when we found this remote spot about 40 miles northeast of Snoqualmie Pass, we figured we'd hit the jackpot. No marked trails, no campsites, just pure wilderness. The kind of place where you can actually hear yourself think, you know. The drive up was normal enough. We took Jake's old Jeep as far as the logging road would take us, then hiked about 6 miles deeper into the forest. The trees got thicker the further we went, those massive Douglas firs creating this cathedral ceiling above us. It was beautiful, honestly, the kind of place that makes you feel small, but in a good way. We set up camp in this little clearing next to a stream. Perfect spot, really. Fresh water, level ground, and surrounded by these huge boulders that would block the wind. As the sun started setting on that first day, we got a fire going and cooked some dinner. Everything felt right with the world. That's when Jake first mentioned hearing something moving around in the trees behind our tent. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. Wildlife's everywhere out there. But Jake's got pretty good hearing, better than mine, and he kept turning his head toward the same spot every few minutes. The first night passed without incident, though I'll admit I slept lighter than usual. You know how it is when you're camping. Every little sound gets amplified. A twig snaps, and suddenly your brain thinks it's a bear crashing through your campsite. But morning came. We had coffee and oatmeal, and everything seemed normal again. Day 2 started perfectly. We did some exploring, found this incredible waterfall about a mile upstream, took some photos. Jake seemed more relaxed, joking around like his usual self. We spent the afternoon fishing, caught enough trout for dinner. Life was good. But as evening approached, things started feeling off again. It was subtle at first. The forest just seemed quieter than it should have been. You know how there's usually this constant background noise of birds and insects and small animals moving around? That was gone. Complete silence except for the stream running next to our camp. Jake noticed it too. We were sitting by the fire after dinner when he suddenly went completely still and held up his hand for me to stop talking. We both listened for maybe 30 seconds. Nothing. Just that unnatural quiet pressing in around us from all directions. Then we heard it. This low sound, almost like humming, but not quite. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, like the forest itself was making the noise. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Jake and I looked at each other, and I could see my own confusion reflected in his face. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was wind through the trees, even though there wasn't any wind. Maybe some kind of bird call we'd never heard before. But deep down, we both knew it was something else. Something wrong. The humming came back 3 more times that night, always from different directions, always lasting just long enough to make your skin crawl before cutting off into that oppressive silence. We kept the fire burning bigger than necessary and barely slept. Morning couldn't come fast enough, and when it did, we seriously considered packing up early. But we'd driven so far and hiked so deep, and honestly, daylight made everything seem less threatening. We decided to stick it out one more night. That was the biggest mistake we could have made. That third day, we started noticing other things. Small things that individually didn't mean much, but together painted this picture that made my stomach twist. Our campsite looked different when we came back from a short hike. Nothing obviously disturbed, but somehow wrong. Like someone had moved everything just slightly out of place. The rocks around our fire pit weren't arranged the way we'd left them. I'm sure of it because I'm particular about that kind of thing. Our tent seemed to be facing a different direction, though that sounds crazy even as I say it. And there were these marks in the dirt nearby, almost like tracks, but not quite matching any animal I could identify. Jake found something else that afternoon. He was gathering firewood when he called me over to this tree about 50 yards from camp. Carved into the bark, maybe 7 feet up, were these symbols. Not letters or words, just these weird angular shapes that looked deliberate but meaningless. They were fresh, too. The bark was still weeping sap. We should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at us to pack up and get out of there. But Jake wanted to stay. He was convinced there was some logical explanation, maybe other campers playing pranks or something. I wish I'd trusted my gut and insisted we leave. As soon as the sun started setting, that unnatural quiet descended again. But this time, it felt different. Heavier somehow, like the silence itself was alive and watching us. We sat by our fire, barely talking, jumping at every little sound our own movements made. The humming started earlier that night, and it was louder, much louder. It seemed to circle our campsite, moving through the trees in a pattern that didn't make sense for any animal. Sometimes it came from ground level, sometimes from high in the canopy. Sometimes it seemed to be coming from directly beneath us. But the worst part was what happened around midnight. Jake had dozed off in his camp chair, and I was trying to stay awake to keep watch when I saw movement in the tree line. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was too tall, too thin, and moving wrong. It stood behind this massive pine tree, just at the edge of our firelight, and it was watching us. I couldn't make out details, just this tall, dark shape that seemed to shift and waver like heat rising off summer asphalt. But I could feel its attention focused on us with this intensity that made my chest tight and my hands shake. I tried to wake Jake without making any sudden movements, but before I could, the thing stepped back into the darkness and vanished. I sat there for the next 4 hours, feeding the fire and scanning the tree line, but I never saw it again that night. When I told Jake about it the next morning, he thought I'd been hallucinating from lack of sleep and stress. Maybe he was right, but I knew what I'd seen. We packed up immediately and started hiking back to the Jeep. The hike out was the longest 6 miles of my life. That feeling of being watched was constant now, pressing against us from all directions. Every few hundred yards, we'd hear branches breaking in the forest around us, always just out of sight. The humming followed us too, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never completely gone. About halfway back to the vehicle, Jake finally admitted he could feel it too. Something moving parallel to us through the trees, keeping pace but staying hidden. We picked up our speed, practically jogging with 40-pound packs on our backs. We made it to the Jeep as the sun was setting, threw our gear in the back, and got out of there as fast as that old engine would take us. Neither of us said much during the drive home. What was there to say? I've been back to the Cascades since then, other areas, and they feel normal. Whatever was in that particular stretch of forest, it belonged to that place. Jake and I don't talk about what happened much, but sometimes I catch him staring off into space with this haunted look, that tells me he's thinking about it too. The thing that bothers me most isn't what we saw or heard. It's the certainty that we were never alone out there, not for a single moment. Something was studying us, learning about us, maybe deciding what to do with us. And honestly, I think we got lucky that it decided to let us leave. I still love camping, still love the wilderness, but I listen to my instincts now. When that primitive part of your brain starts screaming that something's wrong, when the forest goes quiet and your skin starts crawling for no logical reason, trust it. Don't be like us. Don't stick around to see what happens next. Some places aren't meant for people. Some things are better left undisturbed. And sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is admit you're not at the top of the food chain and get the hell out while you still can. So there I was, 3 miles deep into Shenandoah National Park with my buddy Chris, thinking we'd found the perfect campsite. We'd been hiking since dawn, looking for this secluded spot Chris had read about online. You know how it is when you're young and think you're invincible. We wanted to get as far away from civilization as possible, really experience nature without all the crowded campgrounds and RV noise. The spot we found seemed perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick woods with a little creek running nearby. We set up our tent just as the sun was starting to set. The first night was actually pretty normal. We made a fire, cooked some hot dogs, told stupid jokes, the usual camping stuff. But around midnight, something woke me up. At first, I thought it was just Chris moving around in his sleeping bag, but when I looked over, he was dead asleep. That's when I heard it again. This weird scratching sound, like fingernails on bark, coming from somewhere outside our tent. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes, just listening. The scratching would start, stop for a few seconds, then start again. It was moving around our campsite in a slow circle. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent flap and peek out. The fire had died down to just glowing embers, but I could make out the tree line pretty well. Nothing there. The scratching stopped the moment I opened the tent. I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or something and went back to sleep. But the next morning, when we were packing up to explore the area, I noticed these weird marks on the trees around our campsite. Deep scratches, way too high up to be from any normal animal. They were about 7 feet off the ground, and there were 4 parallel gouges in each mark, like someone had dragged their fingernails down the bark. Chris thought I was being paranoid, but something about those marks really bothered me. They looked fresh, and they definitely hadn't been there when we set up camp. We decided to hike deeper into the woods anyway. The trail we followed got fainter and fainter until it basically disappeared completely. That should have been our first warning to turn back. We were probably 5 miles from our campsite when we found a cabin. It was this tiny, run-down shack that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The roof was half caved in, and there were holes in the walls big enough to stick your arm through. But what really caught our attention was the smell. This awful, rotten smell that got stronger as we got closer. Chris wanted to explore inside, because of course he did. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. We pushed open what was left of the front door and stepped inside. The smell hit us like a wall. In the far corner of the single room, there was this pile of what looked like animal bones, but they were arranged in this weird, deliberate pattern, like someone had been collecting them and organizing them by size. That's when we noticed the scratches on the inside walls. The same 4-line gouges we'd seen on the trees, but these covered every surface. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. It looked like someone had been trapped in there and had spent months or years just clawing at everything. We got out of there fast and headed back toward our campsite. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. On the way back, we kept hearing footsteps behind us. Every time we'd stop to listen, they'd stop too. When we'd start walking again, there they were, always staying just far enough back that we couldn't see who or what was making them. By the time we got back to our campsite, it was getting dark again. We were both pretty spooked by this point, but we'd already paid for 2 nights and driven 3 hours to get there. We decided to tough it out one more night. What we should have done was listen to our guts. Something wasn't right, and we knew it. We built up the fire nice and high this time, and made sure we had plenty of extra wood nearby. For a while, everything seemed normal. We ate dinner, played some cards, tried to forget about the creepy cabin and the weird scratches. But around 10 o'clock, the footsteps started again. This time, they weren't trying to hide. We could hear them clearly, circling our campsite just outside the ring of firelight. Slow, deliberate steps, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. Chris grabbed his flashlight and tried to shine it into the woods, but the beam just seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness. Then we heard the voice. It was raspy and barely human, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. It was whispering something, but we couldn't make out the words. The voice would move from one side of our campsite to the other, and sometimes even seeming to come from up in the trees. We spent the entire night huddled in our tent, taking turns to keep watch. Every now and then, we'd hear that scratching sound again, and the tent walls would shake like something was running its fingers along the outside. Neither of us slept a minute. As soon as there was enough light to see, we packed up everything as fast as we could and started hiking back to the parking lot. We didn't talk much on the way out. What was there to say? We both knew we'd experienced something that didn't have a logical explanation. It wasn't until we were almost back to the car that we realized we were being followed again. But this time, when we turned around, we could see it. About 50 yards behind us was this tall, thin figure. Too far away to make out any details, but definitely human-shaped. It would stop whenever we stopped, and start walking when we did. We picked up our pace, and so did our follower. When we started jogging, it started jogging too. By the time we reached the parking lot, we were running flat out. I've never been so happy to see our beat-up Honda Civic in my life. As we threw our gear in the trunk and jumped in the car, I looked back one more time. The figure was standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching us. Even from that distance, I could tell it was way too tall and thin to be normal. Its arms seemed to hang down past its knees. We drove straight home without stopping. Windows up, doors locked. Neither of us talked about what happened for weeks afterward. When we finally did, we both agreed we'd never go camping in that area again. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm lying in bed at night. What was in those woods? Who was following us? And those scratches on the trees and in that cabin? What could have made marks like that? I've done some research since then, trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was just some crazy hermit living out there in the woods. Maybe we stumbled into someone's territory and they were trying to scare us off. But deep down, I know what we encountered wasn't entirely human. The worst part is thinking about what might have happened if we'd stayed another night, or if our follower had decided to get closer instead of just watching from a distance. Sometimes I have nightmares about waking up in that tent to find those long, thin fingers scratching their way through the fabric. Chris and I still go camping sometimes, but never anywhere that remote. We stick to established campgrounds now, places with other people around and park rangers nearby. Call us paranoid if you want, but some things are better left alone. That was 3 years ago, and I still get goosebumps every time I hear scratching sounds at night. Even if it's just tree branches against my window or my cat sharpening his claws, my mind immediately goes back to those woods and whatever was out there in the darkness, watching us, following us, and leaving those impossible scratches on everything it touched. That night in the Cascade Mountains, something was hunting us, and it wasn't an animal. What happened to me and my 2 college friends during a weekend camping trip changed how I think about the wilderness forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand why I haven't pitched a tent since that October weekend, and why you might want to think twice before your next solo camping adventure. But first, let me paint you the picture of how this all started, because context matters when your life depends on reading the signs correctly. It was October 2022, peak fall colors in Washington State. My friends Jake and Sarah had been planning this camping trip for months. We were all seniors at the University of Washington, stressed out of our minds with thesis deadlines and job applications. Sarah found this remote spot in the North Cascades through some obscure hiking forum, a place called Devil's Backbone Ridge. The name should have been our first red flag, but we were young and stupid and desperate for an Instagram-worthy adventure. The location was perfect on paper. Secluded lake, stunning mountain views, and best of all, completely free of other campers. The trailhead was 40 minutes down a logging road that Google Maps barely recognized. Sarah kept saying how amazing it would be to have the whole place to ourselves. No crowds, no noise, just pure wilderness. She had no idea how right she was about the isolation part. We arrived Friday afternoon with enough supplies for 3 days. The hike to our campsite was gorgeous, I'll give it that. Golden aspen leaves carpeted the trail, and the air had that crisp mountain bite that makes you feel alive. After 2 hours of hiking, we reached the lake. It was exactly what Sarah had promised. A mirror-perfect circle of water surrounded by towering pines and granite peaks. We set up our tents on a small peninsula jutting into the lake, giving us panoramic views in every direction. That first evening was magical. We built a fire, cooked some decent camp food, and spent hours just talking and laughing under more stars than any of us had ever seen. Jake brought his guitar, and Sarah had packed enough marshmallows to feed a small army. Looking back, it felt like the universe was lulling us into a false sense of security. The first strange thing happened around 10 that night. We were sitting around the dying fire when Jake suddenly went quiet. He held up his hand for us to stop talking and tilted his head like he was listening for something. When we asked what was wrong, he said he thought he heard whistling coming from across the lake. Not bird calls or wind through the trees, but an actual melody, like someone whistling a tune. Sarah and I strained our ears, but couldn't hear anything except the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Jake insisted he'd heard it, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to echo off the mountains. We teased him about it, said the altitude was getting to him, but I noticed he kept glancing across the lake for the rest of the evening. We turned in around 11, tired from the hike and the mountain air. Our tents were arranged in a small triangle around the fire pit, close enough that we could talk to each other through the tent walls. I remember falling asleep to the sound of water lapping against the rocky shore, feeling completely at peace. I woke up at 2:15 in the morning to absolute silence. Not the normal quiet of a wilderness night, but an unnatural, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. No insects chirping, no water sounds, no wind in the trees. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire forest. I lay there for several minutes, trying to figure out what had woken me, when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. Not the random wandering of a deer or the hurried scurrying of smaller animals. These were measured, purposeful steps, like someone walking a perimeter around our tents. My heart started pounding so hard, I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I wanted to wake Jake and Sarah, but something primal told me to stay completely still. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, always maintaining the same distance from our tents, never getting closer, but never moving away. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. I held my breath and listened. Through the thin nylon of my tent wall, I could hear breathing. Not the quick panting of an animal, but slow, controlled human breathing. Someone was standing less than 3 feet away from me, and they knew exactly where I was. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard those same measured footsteps moving away, fading into the forest. I lay awake until dawn, too terrified to move, straining my ears for any sound of return. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The forest was alive with normal sounds again. Birds singing, a light breeze rustling the leaves. Jake and Sarah were both sleeping soundly, and everything looked exactly as we'd left it the night before. I walked the perimeter of our campsite looking for footprints, but found nothing conclusive in the rocky soil. At breakfast, I decided not to mention the incident. Jake and Sarah were both in great moods, excited about a day hike we'd planned around the lake. I didn't want to ruin their trip with what might have been an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies. But Jake had his own story to tell. He'd woken up around 3 in the morning and seen a light moving through the trees on the far side of the lake. Not a flashlight or headlamp, but something dimmer and more diffuse, like a lantern swinging back and forth. He watched it for several minutes before it disappeared into the forest. Sarah laughed it off, said it was probably just another camper who couldn't sleep. But we all knew we were the only people for miles around. The nearest established campground was over 20 miles away, and the trail we'd used was barely marked on any official maps. We spent that Saturday exploring the area around the lake. The landscape was breathtaking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times throughout the day, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, shadows flitting between trees that were gone when I turned to look directly. The most unsettling moment came when we were eating lunch on a rocky outcrop overlooking the lake. Sarah was taking pictures when she suddenly lowered her camera and frowned. She pointed across the water to a stand of dead trees on the opposite shore and asked if we saw anything moving over there. We all stared in that direction, and sure enough, something was moving among those skeletal branches. It was too far away to make out details, but whatever it was seemed to be keeping pace with us as we moved along the shoreline. When we stopped, it stopped. When we walked, it walked. Jake suggested it might be a bear or elk following us out of curiosity, but the movement was wrong for any animal I'd ever seen. Too upright, too deliberate. It reminded me of someone trying very hard to stay hidden while still keeping us in sight. That evening, we built our fire earlier and bigger than the night before. None of us said it explicitly, but we were all spooked. The joking and laughing from the previous night was replaced by nervous conversation and long periods of silence where we all just stared into the flames. As darkness fell, the forest around us seemed to close in. The friendly, Instagram-worthy wilderness of the afternoon transformed into something ancient and hostile. Every shadow beyond our firelight could be hiding anything. Around 9 o'clock, Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm. She was staring intently at the tree line behind our tents, her face pale in the firelight. When I followed her gaze, I saw it too. A figure standing motionless among the pines, just barely visible in the darkness beyond our camp. It was definitely human in shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too still, positioned in a way that suggested it had been watching us for some time. We sat frozen, afraid to move or speak, afraid that any acknowledgement might invite it closer. Jake slowly reached for his headlamp, but before he could turn it on, the figure melted back into the trees. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving us questioning whether we'd seen anything at all. We didn't sleep much that second night. We took turns keeping watch, feeding the fire constantly to maintain a circle of light around our tents. Twice during my watch, I heard that same whistling Jake had mentioned the first night. A slow, mournful tune that seemed to come from different directions, sometimes close, sometimes far away, always just at the edge of hearing. By morning, we'd all agreed to pack up and leave a day early. We were exhausted, paranoid, and honestly terrified. Whatever was out there with us wasn't showing any signs of losing interest, and we weren't equipped to deal with something we couldn't understand. Breaking camp felt like the longest hour of my life. Every sound from the forest made us jump. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. We kept checking over our shoulders, expecting to see that tall figure watching us from the tree line. The hike back to our car should have felt like an escape, but instead it felt like a retreat under siege. The forest that had seemed so beautiful on our way in now felt maze-like and threatening. Branches seemed to reach for us. Roots tried to trip us, and more than once we heard what sounded like footsteps paralleling our path through the trees. About halfway back to the trailhead, Sarah made a discovery that still haunts me. She'd stopped to retie her boot and happened to look down at a patch of soft earth beside the trail. There, pressed deep into the mud, was a single bare footprint. Not a boot print or hiking shoe, but the clear impression of a human foot. Only it was wrong, elongated and narrow, with toes that seemed too long for any normal foot. We stood around that print in silence, each of us trying to process what we were seeing. Jake finally broke the tension by suggesting we keep moving. None of us wanted to stick around to see who or what had made that print. The rest of the hike passed in tense silence. We didn't stop to rest, didn't pause to take pictures, just pushed forward with single-minded determination to reach our car and get the hell out of there. When we finally saw our vehicle in the distance, I nearly cried with relief. But our ordeal wasn't quite over. As Jake fumbled with the car keys, Sarah grabbed my shoulder and pointed back toward the trailhead. Standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the dappled shadows, was that same tall figure. It stood perfectly still, watching us, waiting to see what we would do. Jake got the car started, and we didn't look back as we drove away. None of us spoke during the 40-minute drive down that logging road. We were too shaken, too confused by what we'd experienced to process it into words. It wasn't until we were back in cell phone range that we started talking about what had happened. Even then, our conversations were fragmented, incomplete. How do you explain something that defies explanation? How do you describe an encounter that challenges everything you thought you knew about the natural world? I've researched that area extensively since our trip. Devil's Backbone Ridge doesn't appear on any official Forest Service maps. The hiking forum where Sarah found the location mysteriously disappeared a few months after our visit. Most disturbing of all, I found scattered reports dating back decades of campers and hikers going missing in that general area, vanishing without a trace despite extensive search efforts. 3 years later, I still don't know what we encountered in those mountains. Part of me wants to believe it was just our imaginations running wild, a case of group hysteria fueled by isolation and too many campfire stories. But I can't explain away that footprint, or the coordinated way whatever was out there seemed to be observing us, learning our patterns, testing our responses. Jake refuses to talk about the trip anymore. He sold all his camping gear and now spends his weekends in coffee shops and movie theaters, firmly planted in civilization. Sarah moved to Phoenix after graduation, claiming she needed more desert in her life. But I suspect she just wanted to get as far away from dense forests as possible. As for me, I've become obsessed with researching similar encounters. Forums dedicated to unexplained wilderness experiences, first-hand accounts of people who've seen things they can't explain, historical records of indigenous legends about beings that live in the spaces between the human world and true wilderness. What I've learned is that we're not alone in our experience. Every year, hundreds of people report encounters with something in the deep woods, something that watches and follows and waits. Most dismiss these stories as imagination or misidentification. But after what happened at Devil's Backbone Ridge, I know better. The wilderness isn't empty. There are things out there, old things that have learned to stay hidden from our modern world. They watch us from the shadows, study our behavior, and occasionally reveal themselves to those unlucky enough to venture too far from the safety of civilization. So here's my advice. If you're planning a camping trip to somewhere truly remote, somewhere that doesn't appear on mainstream maps or guidebooks, maybe reconsider. And if you do go, pay attention to the signs. When the forest goes quiet, when you feel eyes watching from the darkness, when your instincts scream that something is wrong, trust them. Because sometimes, in the deepest wilderness, we're not the apex predator we think we are. Sometimes, we're just visitors in a world that tolerates our presence only as long as we don't stay too long or dig too deep. That thing is still out there, waiting in the shadows of Devil's Backbone Ridge, waiting for the next group of naive campers who think they can claim a piece of wilderness for themselves. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I swear I can still hear that haunting whistle carried on the wind.